The sun blazed mercilessly over the red canyon walls as Jake Thunderhorse struggled against the thick ropes that bound his wrists to the ancient oak tree. His Apache heritage had taught him patience, but the burning sensation in his shoulders and the taste of blood in his mouth made it hard to stay calm. 3 days earlier, he had been tracking a band of cattle rustlers through these very canyons. Now he was their prisoner, left to die in the scorching desert heat. The rustlers had made a serious mistake when they chose to steal from the Broken Arrow Ranch. Jake had been working as a scout for the local sheriff, using his tracking skills to hunt down criminals who thought they could disappear into the vast wilderness. His reputation as a tracker was known throughout the territory. People called him the Shadow Walker because he could follow a trail that others couldn't even see. The morning had started like any other. Jake rode his black stallion, Storm, through the winding paths between the red rocks. The tracks he followed told a clear story. 5 horses, heavily loaded, moving fast toward the border. The rustlers thought they were clever, but they left signs everywhere. Broken branches, disturbed stones, even horse droppings that were still fresh. Jake knew he was gaining on them. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, the crack of a rifle echoed off the rocks. A bullet whistled past his ear, so close he felt the heat. Storm reared up on his hind legs, and Jake had to use all his skill to stay in the saddle. More shots followed, coming from the rocks above. The rustlers had set a trap, and he had walked right into it. "Get down from that horse, Apache," a rough voice shouted from behind a boulder. "We know who you are, Thunderhorse. You've been following us for 2 days." Jake slowly dismounted, his hands raised. He counted at least 4 different voices calling out from the rocks around him. These weren't ordinary cattle thieves. They knew his name, knew his reputation. Someone had told them he was coming. The leader emerged from behind the rocks. He was a big man with a thick beard and cruel eyes. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent sneer. Jake recognized him from wanted posters. Buck Morrison, leader of the Red Canyon Gang. There was a $500 bounty on his head. "Well, well," Morrison said, walking closer with his rifle pointed at Jake's chest. "The famous Apache tracker. You've caused us a lot of trouble, boy. Time to pay for it." 2 other men appeared, their guns also trained on Jake. One was tall and thin, with nervous eyes that darted back and forth. The other was short and stocky, with arms like tree trunks. They all looked like men who had spent years running from the law. "Tie him up," Morrison ordered. "We'll leave him here for the buzzards. By the time anyone finds him, we'll be long gone." They forced Jake to walk deeper into the canyon, where an old oak tree stood alone in a small clearing. The tree was ancient, its thick trunk scarred by lightning and weather. Its branches stretched wide, providing the only shade for miles around. The stocky man produced a length of rope and began binding Jake's hands behind his back. The rope was rough and new, and they pulled it so tight it cut into his skin. Then they pushed him against the tree and tied him securely to the trunk. "You picked the wrong gang to mess with, Apache," Morrison said, leaning close enough that Jake could smell whiskey on his breath. "We got friends in high places. Friends who don't like Indian trackers making trouble for honest businessmen." Jake said nothing, but his mind was working. Morrison's words confirmed what he had suspected. Someone with influence was protecting these rustlers. Someone who wanted him out of the way permanently. Morrison pulled out a knife and held it close to Jake's throat. "Any last words, tracker?" "You made one mistake," Jake said quietly. "What's that?" "You left my horse alive." Morrison laughed. "What good is a horse gonna do you now? You ain't going nowhere." After the rustlers rode away, Jake was alone with the desert. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became almost unbearable. Sweat ran down his face and stung his eyes. His throat was already dry, and he knew he wouldn't last long without water. But Jake Thunderhorse wasn't ready to die. His Apache grandfather had taught him that the desert was not an enemy to be fought, but a teacher to be respected. Every plant, every rock, every shadow had something to offer if you knew how to look. He started working on the ropes, using a technique his grandfather had shown him years ago. By moving his wrists in a certain way, he could gradually loosen the bonds. It was slow work, and the rough rope tore at his skin, but he didn't stop. As the hours passed, Jake heard something that made his heart race, hoofbeats coming fast, but they were too light to be the rustlers returning. These were different horses, moving with a purpose that wasn't driven by greed or fear. Through the heat shimmer, 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Even from a distance, Jake could tell they were women. They sat their horses with confidence, and they were armed. As they drew closer, he could see they were young, probably in their 20s, with the kind of bearing that came from years in the saddle. The woman in the lead had long red hair tied back with a blue bandana. She rode a paint horse and carried a Winchester rifle across her saddle. To her right was a blonde woman on a chestnut mare, twin pistols on her hips. The third rider had dark hair and rode a gray stallion. She carried a shotgun and had the alert posture of someone who had seen trouble before. They spotted Jake tied to the tree and rode toward him at a gallop. The red-haired woman reached him first and jumped down from her horse. "Well, I'll be," she said in a voice with a slight southern accent. "Looks like we found ourselves a genuine Apache warrior in distress." "Cut me loose," Jake said. "There's a gang of rustlers headed for the border. They've got stolen cattle and they're armed and dangerous." The blonde woman dismounted and pulled out a sharp knife. "Hold still," she said. "These ropes are tight." "I'm Sarah McKenna," the red-haired woman said as her friend worked on the ropes. "This is my sister Beth and our friend Maria Santos. We've been tracking the same gang you have." Jake felt the ropes fall away and rubbed his wrists to restore circulation. "Jake Thunderhorse, how did you know I was tracking them?" "Word gets around," Maria said, still mounted on her gray horse. "Sheriff Coleman sent a telegram to our town, said his best tracker was missing and asked for help." Sarah handed Jake a canteen of water. He drank gratefully, feeling strength return to his body. These women weren't what they appeared to be. They moved like experienced fighters, and their horses were top quality. There was more to their story. "Who are you really?" Jake asked. Sarah smiled. "We're bounty hunters. The Morrison gang has a price on their heads, and we aim to collect it." Jake studied the 3 women with new respect. Bounty hunters were a rare breed, and female bounty hunters were rarer still. These women had to be exceptionally skilled to survive in such a dangerous profession. "The Morrison gang is bigger than you think," Jake warned them. "I counted at least 4 men, maybe more. They're well armed, and they know these canyons." Beth finished cutting the last of the ropes and stepped back. "We know exactly who we're dealing with. Buck Morrison, Tom Bradley, Slim Johnson, and Carlos Mendez. There might be a 5th man, but we haven't confirmed it yet." "You've done your homework," Jake said, impressed despite himself. Maria climbed down from her horse and opened her saddlebags. She pulled out a small medical kit and began cleaning the rope burns on Jake's wrists. "We've been hunting this gang for 3 months. They killed a sheriff in our town and robbed the bank. This is personal." Sarah walked to the edge of the clearing and scanned the horizon with a small telescope. "They can't be more than 2 hours ahead of us. With the cattle slowing them down, we can catch up before dark." Jake felt his strength returning as he drank more water and ate some jerky the women shared with him. "There's something else you should know. Morrison mentioned having friends in high places. Someone's protecting them." The 3 women exchanged glances. Beth spoke first. "We suspected as much. They've escaped capture too many times to be just lucky." "Judge Harlan Crawford," Sarah said quietly. "He owns half the territory and has his fingers in everything from cattle ranching to railroad contracts. We think he's been tipping off the gang about law enforcement movements." Jake nodded grimly. "That would explain how they knew I was tracking them. Crawford has connections in every sheriff's office." A whistle pierced the air, coming from Maria, who was still scanning the desert. Riders approaching from the east, 3 of them moving fast. They all grabbed their weapons and took cover behind the rocks. Jake was unarmed, having lost his rifle when the gang captured him, but Beth handed him one of her pistols. "Can you handle that?" she asked. "I'll manage," Jake replied, checking the weapon's ammunition. The riders came closer, and Jake recognized them immediately. It was Morrison and 2 of his men returning to check on their prisoner. They must have realized they had made a mistake leaving him alive. "He's gone," Morrison's voice carried clearly across the canyon. "The ropes are cut. Someone helped him escape. The three outlaws dismounted and examined the area around the tree. Tom Bradley, the tall, thin one, pointed at the ground. Fresh horse tracks. The three horses, all shod. These ain't Indian ponies, bounty hunters, Slim Johnson said nervously. Got to be. Nobody else would come out here. Morrison cursed loudly. They can't be far. Spread out and find them. There's too much money at stake to let that Apache ruin everything. Jake whispered to Sarah, who was crouched beside him behind a large boulder. There are only 3 of them. Where's the 4th man? Probably with the cattle, she whispered back. This might be our chance to even the odds. Sarah gave hand signals to her companions. Years of working together had taught them to communicate without words. Beth moved to a position that would give her a clear shot at Bradley. Maria circled around to get behind Johnson. Sarah kept her rifle trained on Morrison. The outlaws split up, just as the women had hoped. Bradley walked toward the rocks where Beth was hidden. Johnson headed for Maria's position. Morrison stayed near the tree, studying the ground for more tracks. Jake watched Sarah take careful aim at Morrison. Her hands were steady, and her breathing was controlled. This wasn't her first gunfight. Now, Sarah whispered. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Bradley spun around and fell as Beth's bullet caught him in the shoulder. Johnson dove for cover as Maria's shot kicked up dust beside his head. Morrison dropped flat as Sarah's bullet passed inches over his back. The fight was on. Bradley tried to crawl behind a rock, clutching his wounded arm. Johnson fired blindly toward Maria's position, his shots going wild. Morrison rolled behind the oak tree and began shooting at Sarah's boulder. "Give it up, Morrison," Sarah called out. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." "Go to hell," Morrison shouted back. "Judge Crawford's got $1,000 on your heads. Dead or alive?" That confirmed what they had suspected about Crawford's involvement. The corrupt judge wasn't just protecting the gang. He was actively hunting down anyone who threatened his operation. Jake worked his way around the clearing, using his Apache training to move silently from rock to rock. He wanted to get close enough to Morrison to take him alive. The outlaw leader was worth more money captured than killed, and they needed him to testify against Crawford. A sudden movement caught Jake's eye. A 4th man was approaching the clearing from the south, moving carefully through the brush. It was Carlos Mendez, the gang member they hadn't accounted for. He carried a rifle and was trying to get into position to ambush the women. Jake had no choice. He raised Beth's pistol and fired a warning shot over Mendez's head. "Drop your weapon!" Mendez spun toward Jake and fired. The bullet struck the rock beside Jake's head, sending sharp fragments flying. Jake rolled to new cover and fired again, this time aiming to wound rather than kill. The shot caught Mendez in the leg, and he went down hard. His rifle flew from his hands and landed several feet away. He tried to crawl toward it, but Jake was already moving. Meanwhile, the battle in the clearing continued. Johnson made a run for his horse, but Maria was ready for him. Her shotgun blast caught him in the legs, and he tumbled to the ground, wounded but alive. Bradley had managed to reach his horse despite his wounded shoulder. He was trying to mount when Beth appeared beside him, her pistol pressed against his ribs. "I wouldn't if I were you," she said calmly. That left only Morrison. The outlaw leader realized his position was hopeless. His men were down, and he was surrounded. But he wasn't the type to surrender easily. "I've got dynamite in my saddlebags," he shouted. "Back off or I'll blow us all to kingdom come." Sarah and the others exchanged worried glances. Morrison was desperate enough to carry out his threat. They needed a different approach. Jake had secured Mendez's rifle and was moving through the rocks toward Morrison's position. His Apache training had taught him patience and stealth. He could get close enough to disarm Morrison before the outlaw could reach his horse and the dynamite. But as Jake crept closer, he heard something that made his blood run cold. More hoofbeats coming from the west. At least 6 riders moving fast. Either the gang had more members than they thought, or Judge Crawford had sent his private army to clean up the situation. "Company's coming!" Maria called out, having spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Sarah made a quick decision. "We need to end this now and get out of here. That's too many riders to fight in open ground." Jake was close enough to Morrison now to hear the outlaw's heavy breathing. The man was scared and getting more desperate by the minute. Through a gap in the rocks, Jake could see Morrison's horse tied to a dead branch about 20 feet from the oak tree. Time was running out. The approaching riders would be here in minutes, and the women were right about not wanting to fight superior numbers in open terrain. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to make his move. He burst from cover and sprinted toward Morrison, counting on speed and surprise. The outlaw leader spun around and fired hastily. The bullet went wide, and before Morrison could fire again, Jake tackled him to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, fighting for control of Morrison's gun. The outlaw was bigger and stronger, but Jake was quicker and more experienced in hand-to-hand combat. After a brief struggle, Jake managed to pin Morrison's gun hand to the ground. "It's over, Morrison," Jake panted. The sound of approaching horses was getting louder. Sarah ran toward them, her rifle ready. "We need to move, now." But as Jake looked up, he saw something that changed everything. The approaching riders weren't Crawford's men. They were wearing the blue uniforms of the Territorial Cavalry. Help had arrived, but the day's adventures were far from over. The cavalry patrol rode into the clearing with the precision of experienced soldiers. Their leader was a captain with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the wounded outlaws and the unusual group of captors. "I'm Captain William Hayes, Territorial Cavalry," he announced, dismounting from his bay horse. "We received word that the Morrison gang was operating in this area." Sarah stepped forward, lowering her rifle. "Captain Hayes, I'm Sarah McKenna. These are my associates, and this is Jake Thunderhorse, the Apache tracker Sheriff Coleman sent after the gang." Captain Hayes nodded respectfully to Jake. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Thunderhorse. Sheriff Coleman was worried when you didn't report back." Jake helped Morrison to his feet, keeping the outlaw's hands securely bound with rope from Maria's saddlebags. "The sheriff was right to be concerned, Captain. This gang has protection from someone with considerable influence." "Judge Crawford," Beth said bluntly. "We have evidence that he's been feeding information to the Morrison gang." Captain Hayes' expression darkened. "Those are serious accusations, miss." "Judge Crawford is a respected member of the territorial government." "Respected by who?" Maria asked pointedly. "The same people who are getting rich from his corrupt dealings?" Before the captain could respond, Morrison laughed harshly. "You fools don't know what you're getting into. Crawford owns half the politicians in the territory. You think a few cavalry soldiers and some bounty hunters can touch him?" Jake tightened his grip on Morrison's arm. "Maybe not, but you're going to tell us everything you know about Crawford's operation." "I ain't telling you nothing," Morrison spat. Sarah walked over to where Johnson and Bradley sat with their wounds bandaged by her companions. Both men looked defeated and in pain. "What about you two? Ready to spend the rest of your lives in prison for a man who is ready to let you die?" Johnson, the nervous one, broke first. "Crawford's been paying us to steal cattle from small ranchers and drive them across the border. He buys them back at rock-bottom prices through a shell company in Mexico, then sells them to the army at full market value." "Shut up, you fool!" Morrison snarled. But Johnson kept talking. "He's got judges, sheriffs, and railroad officials on his payroll. Anyone who gets too close to exposing the operation just disappears." Captain Hayes listened intently, his face growing more serious with each revelation. "Do you have proof of these allegations?" Beth reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather portfolio. "We've been gathering evidence for months. Forged bills of sale, altered shipping records, and correspondence between Crawford and known criminals." Jake examined the documents over the captain's shoulder. His grandfather had taught him to read English well, and he could see that the evidence was damning. Crawford's operation was vast, involving dozens of accomplices and thousands of stolen cattle. "There's more," Sarah added. "Crawford's been using his position on the Territorial Council to influence land grants and railroad contracts. Small ranchers are forced to sell their land for almost nothing. Then Crawford sells it to the railroad for huge profits." Mendez, sitting with his wounded leg stretched out, spoke up suddenly. "The judge ain't gonna let any of you live long enough to testify. He's got men everywhere, and some of them wear badges. Captain Hayes studied the wounded outlaw. What do you mean? 3 of the deputy sheriffs in this county work for Crawford. So does the federal marshal in Tucson. You bring this evidence to the wrong person, and you'll all end up dead. Jake felt a chill despite the desert heat. If Mendez was telling the truth, their situation was more dangerous than they had realized. Crawford's network was extensive enough to reach into law enforcement at every level. Captain, Jake said quietly, we need to get this evidence to someone we can trust, someone outside Crawford's influence. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I know a federal judge in Santa Fe who has a reputation for honesty. Judge William Montgomery. If we can get the evidence to him, he can issue warrants and bring in federal marshals from outside the territory. That's over 200 miles, Maria pointed out. Crawford's men will try to stop us long before we reach Santa Fe. Sarah studied the map Captain Hayes spread on a flat rock. We'll have to split up, take different routes, and hope at least one group makes it through. I'll take the evidence, Jake volunteered. I know paths through the mountains that Crawford's men won't expect. You're not going alone, Sarah said firmly. This is too important to risk on one person. Captain Hayes looked up from the map. I'll provide an escort. Sergeant Murphy and 3 of my best men can accompany Mr. Bama, Thunderhorse and Miss McKenna to Santa Fe. Beth and Maria would stay behind with the remaining soldiers to guard the prisoners and gather additional evidence from the gang's hideout. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the best they could manage under the circumstances. As they prepared for the journey, Jake noticed smoke rising in the distance. Captain Hayes saw it too and raised his telescope. Riders, the captain said grimly, at least a dozen coming from the direction of Willow Creek. They're moving fast. Morrison laughed again. Looks like the judge heard about your little party. Those'll be his cleanup crew. Jake felt his heart race. Crawford's men were coming, and there wasn't time to reach safety. They would have to fight or find a way to escape through the canyons. Can we outrun them? Sarah asked. Captain Hayes shook his head. Not with wounded prisoners and pack horses. We'd have to abandon everything. The evidence is more important than capturing these outlaws, Jake pointed out. If we can get the documents to Judge Montgomery, he can issue federal warrants for the whole gang. It was a difficult decision, but they didn't have many options. Captain Hayes ordered his men to release the prisoners' bonds and give them their horses back. Get out of here, he told Morrison. But remember, we have your confessions recorded and witnessed. If you're smart, you'll disappear into Mexico and never come back. Morrison rubbed his wrists where the ropes had been. You're making a big mistake, soldier boy. Crawford's gonna hunt you down like dogs. Let him try, Sarah said coldly. We'll be ready for him. The gang rode away, heading south toward the border. Jake watched them go with mixed feelings. It went against his nature to let criminals escape, but getting the evidence to Santa Fe was more important than individual justice. Captain Hayes selected his fastest horses and divided his men into 2 groups. Sergeant Murphy, Corporals Davis and Wilson would accompany Jake and Sarah to Santa Fe. The captain himself would stay with Beth and Maria to gather more evidence and hopefully delay Crawford's men. As Jake swung into Storm's saddle, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The survival of countless honest ranchers and the future of law and order in the territory depended on their mission succeeding. Ready? Sarah asked, checking her rifle one final time. Jake nodded and spurred Storm toward the narrow trail that led into the high country. Behind them, the dust cloud of Crawford's approaching riders grew larger. Ahead lay 200 miles of dangerous territory, controlled by a corrupt judge who would stop at nothing to protect his criminal empire. The chase was about to begin, and Jake Thunderhorse knew that before it was over, he would need every skill his Apache ancestors had taught him. The desert had tested him with heat and thirst. Now it would test him with bullets and betrayal. But he had allies now, and for the first time in days he felt hope. The red canyon walls echoed with the sound of hoofbeats as the small party raced toward justice, knowing that the fate of the entire territory hung in the balance. Crawford's web of corruption was about to face its greatest challenge, and Jake Thunderhorse was determined to see it destroyed.